Hi my dear students, welcome to my biology class. In the previous class, we have learned about gametogenesis, that is about spermatogenesis. Spermatogenesis is the formation of sperms. Today we are going to learn about oogenesis that take place in the female reproductive system. So today's topic is oogenesis. Oogenesis means formation. Oogenesis means formation of ova. Formation of ova take place in the primary sex organs of female. The primary sex organs of the female are a pair of ovaries. Those ovaries are located in the lower abdominal cavity, that is in the pelvic region. The ovary produces both the ova and the ovarian hormones or steroid hormones. This ovary performs dual functions in the female reproductive system. Now we are going to learn about how matured and functional ova are formed in the primary sex organs of the female. So that's about oogenesis. The process oogenesis is entirely different from spermatogenesis. In spermatogenesis, the sperms are produced at the time of puberty. That time only the reproductive organs in male begin to mature and start to produce the sperms. But in the case of oogenesis, it begins during the embryonic stage itself. The early stages of oogenesis begin by about 25 weeks old embryo. During this period, about 2 million oogonia are formed in the female fetal ovary and are entered into the next stage called primary oocyte. Now we are going to learn what are the changes that occur during this particular period. How the oogonia are transformed into primary oocyte. Now we are going to learn about the different phases that are involved in the transformation of oogonia to what? Primary oocytes. 2 million oogonia are formed in each fetal ovary. No more oogonia are added after the birth of the female child. That means all oogonia will be developed during the embryonic stage itself. So the first phase in the ovary, that is the multiplication phase. During multiplication phase, the oogonia that are present in the ovary begin to increase by mitotic division. So, oogonia undergo what? Mitosis. So, it forms many number of mother cells or oogonia. So, that means it increases in number. Each oogonium is diploid in nature. Oogonium is diploid in nature. That means each cell contains what? 23 pairs of chromosomes. So oogonium is a diploid mother germ cells. So those are present in the germinal epithelium of the ovary. During multiplication phase, oogonia undergo mitosis and increase in number. They grow in size and those are known as primary oocytes. The next phase is called growth phase. During growth phase, each primary oocyte is surrounded by a layer of granulosa cells. Suppose this is a primary oocyte. It is surrounded by a layer of what? Granulosa cells. This particular structure with the primary oocyte is called primary follicle. This is called what? Primary follicle. During the embryonic stage, about 2 million such primary follicles are developed in the fetal ovary, in each fetal ovary. But after the birth, when the girl attains the puberty, before the puberty, most of them will be degenerated. Only 60,000 to 80,000 such primary follicles will be remained in the ovary of the female child. Got it? The next phase is the maturation phase. During the maturation phase, the primary oocyte get into the meiosis 1 stage, and then it starts its stage, the prophase 1 stage. Then the stage is temporarily arrested over there. That means no further cell cycles happens inside the primary follicle. No changes of the chromosome during this period. So the phase is temporarily arrested. The meiosis 1 is temporarily arrested over there. So it happens in all primary follicles. That is, each primary follicles consists of primary oocyte. When the child attains puberty, each primary follicle would begin to mature by changing its growth phase and maturation phase. Growth phase means by adding more layers of cells around the developing oocyte. And the maturation phase means the primary oocyte develop into secondary oocyte with the first polar body. The complete maturation of primary oocytes will be happened only when the child is attained puberty. That means when child is menstruated. That means when the first menstrual cycle begins in the female child. What happens? The first ovulation. So it is because of the maturation of secondary oocyte. The primary oocyte would develop into secondary oocyte. That secondary oocyte is released from the ovary by a process called ovulation. Got it? After the attainment of puberty, the primary follicle and the primary oocyte resume development. That means they restart their maturation. So what's the condition of the primary oocyte during the puberty? Let's suppose this is the primary oocyte. It is surrounded by a layer of what? Granulosa cells. This particular structure is known as primary follicle. This is the condition of one immature ovum, primary follicle. This is the granulosa layer. Okay, this is the primary oocyte. When a girl attains puberty, the meiosis 1 will restart. At the same time, transformation of the primary oocyte into secondary oocyte will be taken place over there. Now let's study how it happens. See, this is the condition of the immature ovum when the girl attains puberty. This primary oocyte would develop into secondary oocyte and will be released from the ovary by a process called ovulation. It happens during the first menstrual cycle in human female. That is called menarche. And during this phase, certain changes take place inside and outside the cell. Inside, what happens? Completion of meiosis 1. After meiosis 1, the primary oocyte would develop into secondary oocyte. Secondary oocyte along with a tiny polar body. It is called the first polar body. It is also haploid in nature. The secondary oocyte is haploid in nature, while the primary oocyte is diploid in nature. Got it? It undergoes meiosis 1 and would become as 2 haploid cells. It is an unequal division. Why? Because the secondary oocyte is larger than the polar body. But in the case of the number of chromosomes, both of them are haploid in nature. These are the changes that occur inside the cell. So what happens to outside the cell? Primary follicle is converted into the secondary follicle by adding more granulosa layers of cells and also theca cells. So here I can show you the changes that take place around the primary oocyte during this period. Suppose this is the primary oocyte. Okay, then first there was only one layer, that is primary follicle with the granulosa cells. Then more such granulosa cells are formed around the primary oocyte. Again, the next layer, theca, also formed around this theca layer. Theca layer. Okay, then it is called secondary follicle. This stage is called a secondary follicle. So what happens inside then? The meiosis 1 is taking place. So you have to imagine it. So at the same time, the maturation of the primary oocyte to the secondary oocyte, and also the growth phase also taking place simultaneously. So when theca interna and theca externa are added, the theca layer is transformed into theca externa and theca interna. Then it is called a tertiary follicle. When it forms a tertiary follicle, it carries or it contains a fluid filled cavity called antrum. Okay, so this is the next stage. The primary oocyte is developing as the secondary oocyte. Then more granulosa cells with theca cells. Theca cells. Then theca externa, theca interna. Then it forms as a fluid filled cavity called what? Antrum. Okay, antrum. It is a fluid filled cavity. Then the structure is called tertiary follicle. Tertiary follicle. Okay, again it undergoes certain changes or differentiation and finally would develop as matured Graafian follicle with a large sized antrum. Then finally you can see the secondary oocyte with the matured Graafian follicle. Now you can observe the secondary oocyte with the Graafian follicle, the matured Graafian follicle with the large sized antrum. Graafian follicle, then the large sized antrum, fluid filled cavity antrum. Then this is the secondary oocyte. This is the way the changes take place during the maturation phase and growth phase of the primary oocyte when the girl attains puberty. See, changes take place inside the nucleus and outside the cell. So outside the cell, no follicular cells, theca cells are added to protect the oocyte. Then the primary oocyte completes the first meiotic division, that is a reduction division, so that it produces two haploid structures, that is unequal division, because one is the large sized secondary oocyte, the other one is the tiny first polar body. This secondary oocyte is released from the ovary at the time of ovulation. Then what happens to the secondary oocyte? The secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2 and it will be completed prior to fertilization after the entry of sperm in the fallopian tube, that is in the ampulla, isthmic junction of the fallopian tube. When the sperm is reached over there, the secondary oocyte completes its meiotic divisions, the second meiotic division, and will be transformed into the completely matured functional ootid or ovum. At the time, the second polar body is also released. This is also haploid in nature. The ootid or ovum that is formed at this time is completely functional ovum. Got it? So how can we write this? The secondary oocyte undergoes meiosis 2. Then it forms as what? Ootid or ovum. That means completely functional ovum, and along with the second polar body. So this happens only prior to fertilization. Okay. To understand the process oogenesis more clearly, let's observe the schematic representation of oogenesis. Here you can see the processes that take place in the female body. Okay, the oogonia are developed during the embryonic stage. Those oogonia are diploid in nature. That means each cell consists of 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, they undergo mitosis during the embryonic stage itself, and some of them become large in size. They act as primary oocytes. And at the same time, the primary oocyte undergoes meiosis 1 and it gets into the prophase 1. The stage is temporarily arrested over there. That means that take place during the fetal life. Okay, the meiosis 1 is the lengthy phase in human female. Why? Because the meiosis 1 will be completed prior to the first ovulation of the females. Here we can write will be completed prior to ovulation. Okay, the meiosis 1 resume at the time of puberty, so the rest of the phases take place there. At the same time, the complete maturation of the primary oocyte take place, so that the primary oocyte converts into a secondary oocyte. At the same time, it releases the first polar body. Okay, the secondary oocyte is haploid in nature. After the complete maturation of the secondary oocyte, it is released from the ovary. That process is called ovulation. After ovulation, the ovum is received by the fimbriae of the infundibulum of fallopian tube. Then it is traveled through the ampulla, then finally reaches at the ampulla stomach junction. Then it waits for the sperm entry. Then when the sperm is reached over there, what happens? The meiosis stage, the second meiotic division will be resumed, will be restarted, so that it promotes the next phase, the anaphase stage, anaphase 2, so that the rest of the cell cycle will be completed prior to the fertilization phase. So just before fertilization, the meiotic division 2 will be completed, so it releases a completely matured oocyte or ovum with a tiny second polar body. This oocyte is ready to fuse or fertilize with the sperm. Oocyte is haploid in nature. Then it forms prior to what? Fertilization. So here we can write it forms prior to fertilization. It means that usually during ovulation, the secondary oocyte is released from the ovary of the female, not the completely matured ovum. The complete maturation of ovum or oocyte take place prior to the fertilization, after the presence, after the entry of sperm. That means due to the presence of sperm near to the ovum for fertilization. So during this time, the anaphase promoting factor will be released over there, so that the anaphase stage will be completed inside the secondary oocyte. So the next stage will be completed, so that it would become a completely matured functional oocyte at that time, to ready to fertilize with the sperm. So this is the process oogenesis take place in human female. So here you can see the oogonia are diploid in nature. The primary oocyte is also diploid, but the secondary oocyte is haploid. Then finally the oocyte or ovum is haploid. That means it carries 23 chromosomes. The 23 chromosome carry the genes of the female parent. So the female parent can contribute 50% of the genetic material to the zygote. So that the zygote would get, at the time of fertilization, the zygote would receive the 50% genetic material from the mother and another 50% genetic material from the father through the male gamete, that is through the sperm. One more thing, that when the secondary oocyte is released from the ovary, the secondary oocyte is surrounded or protected by a specific layer called zona pellucida. Now you can observe the diagrammatic representation of the development of ovarian follicles that take place in the ovary. In this diagram, you can observe the primary follicle, then to the secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, matured Graafian follicle with a large sized fluid filled cavity antrum. Then after the complete maturation of the Graafian follicle, the ovum is released, that is the secondary oocyte is released from the ovary. Then after that a remnant is formed, that is called corpus luteum. The corpus luteum secrete a hormone named progesterone that is essential for the regeneration of the uterine endometrium for the further activities for carrying the embryo. Now let's understand the hormonal control of oogenesis. So it is also initiated by hypothalamus. Hypothalamus. The hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, that is GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. This GnRH stimulates the anterior lobe of pituitary to release two hormones such as LH and FSH. Anterior pituitary to secrete what? Two hormones, LH and FSH. LH is the luteinizing hormone, while FSH is the follicle stimulating hormone. Okay, LH surge or the peak level of LH causes the ovulation, that means the releasing out of secondary oocyte from the ovary. It causes what? Ovulation. It also helps in the maturation of the primary oocyte into secondary oocyte. That means it involves in oogenesis. Then follicle stimulating hormone, it involves the development of what? Follicular cells around the primary oocyte. We know that the primary oocyte begins to mature, then certain changes take place outside the primary oocyte, that formation of granulosa cells, theca cells. Okay, these follicular cells are developed with the help of by the stimulation of this particular hormone, what? FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, involved in the follicular growth. Okay, this the developing follicular cells releases a hormone called estrogen. Okay, then both estrogen and LH are very essential for the complete phase of the maturation phase of the what? Primary oocyte into secondary oocyte. I hope you understood the topic well. With this, I conclude my session. Then thank you and have nice moments.